Hello, I'm Ken Decker from Crazy Wolf Studio. I was asked by the Arts Council to do a little talk and maybe a little show and tell on certain projects, and I chose bentwood boxes. And if I could, I'd like to start right from scratch and give a little history on bentwood boxes. Um, Bentwood boxes uh, were a term that was used, I think, probably by the first Europeans, because these boxes weren't just wooden boxes. They were actually a one board that was kerfed in three sections and steamed and bent, and that's why they called them bent boxes. And then the fourth portion of the box was had a little notch in it, and it was bent and pinned with spruce root and probably some pitch from trees to make it a watertight box, because these boxes were used for a little bit of everything. Um, Before the Europeans came and the pots and pans were introduced, the bentwood boxes were something that the Northwest Coast natives used from all the way from Oregon all the way to Yakutat, Alaska, and they used them for everything from storing foods to cooking, and even mortuary boxes. And they came in every size you can imagine. And my theory is that in every village there was a man that was a craftsman box maker, because it's kind of a difficult task in it, and it's beyond me how these people put together these boxes in such a professional way that you look at these boxes that were made 300, 400, maybe 500 years ago with the tools that they had and measurements and whatever, and these boxes were so precise that you would wonder how they came about doing this. And the technology that we have today is, I wouldn't say so much simpler, but it was, because we have power tools, sanders, routers, whatever, measuring sticks that make things so much easier. And these people had very little. Yet if you were to go to some of the old style boxes, which are really, really hard to find now because they were taken away by traders in the 1700s to like Madrid, Spain, Leningrad, Russia. There might be some in America and collectors' possessions, and maybe some even in the Smithsonian and other bigger museums in North America. But if you have the opportunity to look at them, these boxes were done all by hand with things that maybe even were beaver teeth, shells, maybe some amateur blacksmiths made some adze that were copper adze, because it was real hard for them to find metal at that time. And so it was probably a real chore for them to fabricate these boxes, and it might have took a little bit of time. And that's before their carving went on the face of them, or the artwork went on, and that was probably by the box maker too, because it was all part of the craft. I'll show you some boxes here in a little bit that are not done and explain a little bit more about them, but I'd like to start right from the beginning and show you where it would start if I could. This is a cedar plank that's off a tree, and it was probably cut out by a more modern adze that the Europeans had. It's kind of got like, looks like shake material and stuff, but it's not perfectly uniform, but it's what the native people would use for a start. And they didn't have a metal adze. They fabricated wooden wedges, probably from yew wood or seasoned alder, that they would use like a wedge to run between the log and split it so that it would come up kind of uniform. And from this point, they would use their adze, which you would see similar to this, and cut it down so that it was, well, let's say in the neighborhood of an inch or half inch, whatever. It had to be fairly uniform in order to continue this project. So this is kind of where it would start, was with the plank. Now this plank is just only maybe 3 foot or less. So that's all the box you're going to get out of this. Is the longer the box, the bigger the box, the wider the box, the taller the box. So this is where we would start this project. Now I brought up another piece that was milled, and it's not finished, but it gives you an idea. This is, if it was trimmed down to this size with an adze, which would take quite some doing, but these people had some time on their hands, and then they would put the kerf notches in. There's one here, and another down here, and that would determine the size of the box. These between here and there, every one is going to be a little different. So you might have a rectangular chest, or you might have a square box, but these little kerfs in there will tell you how they're put together and the size of them. Now, in steaming a box, after you kerf it, you have to soak the wood underwater for a minimum of 24 hours, get it good and saturated, and then you steam it. And there's different methods of steaming it. More modern ways are build boxes that are kind of insulated and whatever. You can get real high tech. I worked with a real good friend of mine who passed away a couple years ago, and he was Scandinavian descent, so his father was a shipwright, and he had a little bit of knowledge of woodworking and liked to pursue box making with me because he knew I knew box making. And his theory was he wanted to see how I did it and maybe perfect on it, because he had a lot of high-tech wood tools, you know, routers, plunge routers, all kind of saws and stuff. So he wanted to see if it was something that we could do to make it faster. And we worked on this maybe 2 or 3 days a week. We'd kick out boxes and stuff, and we'd make boxes, and he would give some of his boxes to close friends of his. And unfortunately he passed away at some point, and but we had a pretty good run for a couple of years on working with bent boxes. And you always can learn something from somebody, and he was a modern day woodworker and real good with mathematics, which helped make boxes come out a little squarer than you would anticipate, because sometimes you could have a little trouble with getting a good square box. Takes quite a while, and trial by error a few times to make decent boxes. But after you soak it and you can steam it, you can put them in the steam box or a steamer of any kind for a couple hours after that it's been soaked underwater. And you got to get the right temperature. You have to keep it at the right time inside. It all hinges on getting this product perfect. Is timing and temperature, and you've only got a few seconds when it comes out of that steam box to change those molecules and all the corners of those curves you made to make it 90 degrees. And you don't want to really be up on a panic thing, because you've got a little bit of time, but the faster you can do it, the better product you're going to have. And sometimes it looks a little odd, but once you put it together and put a little clamp on it, just leave it alone till another day or so, until it dries a little more, and then you can see what needs to be done to make it look nice. But it'll turn into something that's a real crafty piece if you spend a little time on these things. And the best thing to do if you want to pursue box making is probably check with the Totem Heritage Center. They have classes on it almost every year, and it's been real successful with people, and I've had a lot of feedback that it was good feedback from people that have attended these classes. And when you bend these boxes again, this is a little diagram on, if you look at it, that I made them red to be the piece of wood that we're bending, and I only put in 2 curves. But if you look at the notch in it, you'll see there's a notch and a little bit of an arrow there. That point of the arrow up here is going to end up in the bottom of that square. When you steam it and you pull it out of that box, you bend it, that point goes down into that hole, and it'll end up square. And then you tackle the second one, and you only have to do three of them, and try to do them as fast as you can to get the molecules situated so that they're now bent into what their shape they're going to stay. Otherwise, the colder it gets, they're not going to cooperate with you. You're going to have a mess. But it's just a art form that's just like a blacksmith. You have to look at the temperature, you have to look at the color, you have to look at this and that. Then you know it's not written in stone anywhere. It's like a hands-on thing, learning from someone, and it can be quite fun. And to take a board and do something of this nature. But the people from the Northwest Coast had to have these boxes because they had to put food in them, and they would have a longhouse that might have maybe even a dozen occupants and their families in there, and they would petition them off, and all these families probably had a dozen boxes minimum for each household, and one box might be dehydrated deer meat and salted. Some might be smoked fish, some might be seaweed, but they would all be their food, their provisions for winter. And so they had to have these boxes, and the more elaborate the boxes that looked maybe had a lot more artwork to them, had abalone in them, maybe copper in them. Those were the people that had, or more upper status people in the village that maybe were chief type people. But even the people that weren't of upper status had boxes that they might even been just plain boxes because they couldn't afford to have somebody come do the artwork and whatever at that particular time, but they had to have a box, many of them. So unfortunately, these boxes that all these native people had for hundreds and hundreds of years, they're also hard to find. Even the plain ones, there might be some of them in some of the villages, but after the pots and pans came from Europe, they went to the wayside, and people didn't need them, and they weren't so needy anymore. The pots and pans seemed to do a lot better job, because even the plain boxes were used for cooking, not just storing, but for cooking. The women had 2 or 3 boxes that they would put in a creek with a rock in them so that they wouldn't float off, and just soak them so that when it was time to cook in the afternoon, they would bring the box over to a fire that they'd had going most of the afternoon, and it was now just like charcoal bricklets. There was no real flame. They would elevate the box with water in it, off the charcoal bricklets and put the lid on, just like you would a pots and pan on a stove, and maybe in an hour's time they would have 100-degree temperature in there, maybe even hotter, and they would dip their dried halibut in or their deer meat in and warm it up just like a modern day microwave. These wooden boxes were probably from village cook people that were designated as the cooks for each family, but there was probably a lot of them that they were just strictly for cooking, and they had no design on them. They were just probably blackened from the fire a little bit, but as long as they had water in them, they wouldn't burn up and deteriorate. They'd get a lot of life out of a box. So they weren't just for storing foods, they cooked in them, and they even had them as mortuary boxes. So boxes were something that they had to have, and they had them forever. And nowadays people buy them, and I sell a lot of them here in the store that I do myself. I buy a few from gentlemen in George Bennett and Sitka, and once in a while somebody will bring one in that's kind of an attractive box, but we sell a lot of them, and we even sell a few along with the local mortician for mortuary boxes. So they're also beautiful to just have above your fireplace or around your home as artwork. And what you see here is a smaller box. It's a chest. As you can see, it's not square, it's rectangular. So they're called chests. And this one here has a little bit of artwork on it, and it's pretty much complete. The one that I have over here is one that Norman Nygaard and myself made when we were making several of them when he was alive. And I kind of kept this one around for a while because, you know, it's just sentimental, but it's a good piece to show you how it's fabricated after it's bent, because I like to leave the bottoms off before I paint them, because it's easy to paint. If you handle it like this, you can paint and turn it around this way, whatever. And when I finally get all the artwork on the sides, then I'll fabricate a bottom and I'll fabricate a top. And the other good reasoning behind leaving the bottoms and the top off is because when you want to do the bottom, you have to lay a block out, that's your bottom, and put your board on top, and then you can take a real sharp pencil, go around the edges, pull it off, and then you kerf out these areas here, because if you can see, it's got a recess where it slips up inside, because it keeps it more airtight and waterproof. And also the same thing with the lid. The lid being heavy and awkward and clumsy, you have to put the pencil mark on it too to get the size of the lid, and you see it's also countersunk so that it goes down in. Now the lid itself being awkward looking, there's a reason behind it, is because if you had this in your longhouse and you had a bunch of deer meat in it and you were out picking berries or cooking outside, there may not have been anybody in the longhouse all day, and you might get mink or marten in there that can lift the lid up and get in, and I'm guessing it was a trial by error at some point that they probably lost a lot of food along the way. So they came up with the idea of having this heavier lid, and it's quite heavy, because that way the the mink and the martin and the land otter couldn't lift that lid up. And when you put together a lid like this too, I always look at the piece that's put together where you peg it, and that's the corner that will tell you that you need to make a little mark on the box so that you know it fits, because a square box has 4 chances of fitting, and the chances are it's not going to fit anyway but the one with the star. Same with the bottom, but of course the bottom is glued and it doesn't have that problem anymore once it's glued and pegged. But once you get this thing fabricated and put together and get the lid on and you get the artwork on, then you'll have something like this. But it comes in different stages. It's a long process, but it's kind of fun. And I like to do different projects for different people. When they come in, they might want something besides the bear box on it, or they might want their family crest or whatever. But as long as it's something that's sensible, then we'll do it. And that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed the little talk, and maybe at some point when we reopen after this problems that we're having, people can come down and get a little bit more, a better idea of what we're doing with boxes, rather than just talk on the video. But thank you. Stay safe.